In the days and weeks following the surrender of Nazi Germany, Europe found itself grappling with a monumental task: the disposal, repurposing, and safeguarding of the industrial infrastructure that had been at the heart of the war effort. Among the most significant remnants of this wartime legacy were the German rocket facilities, whose advanced technology had contributed to the development of weapons like the V-1 and V-2 rockets. These sites were scattered across the Reich, from the Peenemünde Research Center on the Baltic coast to the rocket plants in central Germany. The Allies, now victorious but faced with the disintegration of a war-torn continent, had to decide what to do with these facilities, giant complexes that had once stood at the cutting edge of technological warfare. As early as the summer of 1945, the Allies recognized the strategic value of these sites, not just as remnants of Nazi military ambition, but as treasure troves of advanced engineering and research. Yet, amid the ruin of war, the sheer scale of the facilities made them difficult to manage. These were not just factories or laboratories, they were sprawling complexes, often built deep within underground bunkers, sometimes situated in remote or heavily damaged areas, making access and transport difficult. With millions of displaced persons and soldiers to manage, and economies in collapse, the Allied forces found themselves with a formidable logistical problem. The initial wave of decisions focused not on the use of these facilities, but on their immediate security. In the occupied zones, the Allies set up a system of military occupation that divided Germany into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Each zone came with its own priorities, but the rocket facilities quickly became a key issue across the board. In the American and British sectors, officials soon began to realize that while the rocket sites were valuable, they were also cumbersome. The massive infrastructure, much of it designed to produce weapons of mass destruction, could no longer be justified in a post-war world. The need for food, shelter, and basic infrastructure overwhelmed the Allied occupation forces, and the question of what to do with the rocket facilities was soon entwined with these immediate concerns. The American response, in particular, was shaped by the growing recognition that the German rocket scientists, who had worked on the V-2 program under the auspices of figures like Wernher von Braun, represented a valuable pool of talent. This led to the now famous Operation Paperclip, through which the United States sought to bring these scientists into the fold, offering them employment in American research projects in exchange for their expertise. Von Braun himself was among the first to be brought over, and his subsequent work with NASA would later lead to the development of the Apollo space program. The seizure of these scientists, however, did not automatically lead to the repurposing of the facilities themselves. The process of dismantling, cleaning, or destroying the German rocket plants began almost immediately, but this was not as straightforward as simply shutting them down. The enormous plants were located in the heart of war-torn territories. The infrastructure, although advanced, was largely unsalvageable, and many sites had suffered heavy damage from bombing raids and sabotage. In some cases, the scale of destruction was so complete that the sites were rendered unusable almost overnight. For example, the massive underground tunnels at the Mittelwerk rocket factory, where the V-2 rockets were produced in slave labor conditions, required weeks of work just to make them safe to enter. In the Soviet zone of occupation, the fate of the rocket facilities took on a different dimension. The Soviets had long been interested in Germany's advanced military technology, particularly in the realm of rocketry. The Soviets moved quickly to seize control of key German facilities, including the vast complex at Peenemünde. Here, a more systematic approach to acquisition was employed. The Soviets, unlike the Americans, sought not just to acquire the knowledge of the scientists, but to take the technology itself, sometimes even to the point of dismantling the plants piece by piece and shipping them back to the Soviet Union. This process of industrial reparation, which mirrored the policies carried out in other sectors of the economy, was not simply a matter of collecting scrap metal. Entire sections of production lines were dismantled, packed up, and sent to the Soviet Union to be reassembled in factories at home. The Soviets also took great care to secure the expertise of key engineers and scientists. However, the massive logistical challenge of relocating entire rocket plants and their personnel from the heart of Germany to the Soviet Union was not without difficulties. The Soviet Union, in contrast to the United States, had little interest in preserving the infrastructure of the former Nazi war machine. Their focus was on exploitation, on extracting every ounce of knowledge and technology possible to gain a competitive edge in the Cold War arms race. The British and French took a more cautious approach. The British, for instance, were more focused on the immediate task of restoring order to their occupied zones and securing the country's own technological infrastructure. The British Rocket Research Establishment, located in the former wartime headquarters at Farnborough, was already well established by the time the war ended, and there was little interest in trying to revive the German rocket program. Instead, the British were primarily concerned with preventing the Germans from using their own facilities to continue their work. As a result, many of the British efforts in this area were focused on demolition, destruction, and ensuring that no usable equipment or technology could fall into the wrong hands. While the physical dismantling of the rocket factories was underway, a parallel effort began to unfold in the political and economic arenas. The disposal of these facilities, whether through scrapping, destruction, or repurposing, was taking place against the backdrop of a Europe in disarray. Food shortages, rampant unemployment, and the destruction of critical infrastructure left little room for the luxury of repurposing war factories into peacetime industries. In many places, the priority was simple survival. Rocket facilities that might have been seen as symbols of future progress now represented an unbearable burden of past violence. The prospect of keeping these facilities operational for any form of productive work seemed unlikely. As a result, vast quantities of materials were either scrapped or left to rot in place. By the end of 1945, the decisions made by the Allies regarding the rocket facilities were already beginning to show their long-term effects. The United States had largely consolidated its position in the Western zones, and while it had gained access to the intellectual property of the German rocket program, the physical sites themselves were beginning to disappear, either buried in rubble or repurposed for other uses. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had begun reassembling parts of Piedmont and other facilities, but this was a slow and costly process. The fate of the rocket plants remained uncertain, subject to the competing demands of wartime history, post-war recovery, and Cold War ambitions. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the fate of the Nazi rocket facilities was far from settled. While many had been dismantled or abandoned, others were repurposed, and some even became the birthplaces of the next generation of weapons technology. But this was just the beginning of a long and complex journey, one that would eventually intertwine the legacy of Nazi technology with the geopolitics of the Cold War. As the post-war landscape of Europe began to stabilize, the fate of the Nazi rocket facilities continued to evolve, influenced by the shifting priorities of the Allied powers and the emerging Cold War tensions. By 1946, the initial efforts to dismantle, repurpose, or exploit the rocket sites had given way to more calculated and strategic decisions, with both the United States and the Soviet Union keenly aware of the technological potential they had just acquired. The decisions made in this period would reverberate for decades to come, shaping the future of rocketry, space exploration, and military technology. In the American sector, the immediate focus remained on consolidating control over the German scientists and their expertise. While the U.S. government had already started to transport key personnel to American soil as part of Operation Paperclip, the facilities themselves were increasingly seen as superfluous. The sheer scale of the rocket factories, combined with the destruction and decay that accompanied the end of the war, meant that many of the sites were abandoned, left to deteriorate in the ruins of Germany's collapsed infrastructure. Still, the acquisition of critical technology and knowledge made the American investment worthwhile. The United States began shifting its focus from maintaining these sites to adapting the rocket designs and expertise for its own purposes. One of the most significant outcomes of the post-war period was the establishment of the United States' own rocket program. The V-2 rockets, which had once been a symbol of Nazi technological ambition, were now seen as stepping stones for the American military and space programs. The German scientists, many of whom had been at the forefront of the V-2 program, were instrumental in the early development of the U.S. ballistic missile program. Wernher von Braun, who had been the director of the Piedmont Research Center, was perhaps the most notable figure to make the transition from Nazi Germany to the United States. His team, which included many former German engineers and scientists, quickly became the backbone of American efforts to develop long-range rockets and, eventually, the space program. The U.S. government, particularly under the administration of President Harry S. Truman, was keenly aware of the need to not only develop military technologies but also to gain an advantage over the Soviet Union, which had also begun to eye the same rocket technologies. Thus, the initial post-war years saw an intense effort by the U.S. to harness the knowledge of the German rocket scientists, even as the physical infrastructure of the Nazi rocket facilities became less relevant. However, the abandonment of the sites did not mean that all the valuable equipment and materials were left behind. In many cases, valuable rocket components, including engines, blueprints, and other technical data, were carefully removed and shipped back to the United States. For example, the remnants of the V-2 rockets that had been captured by the Allies were dismantled, studied, and replicated. The knowledge gained from these rockets would directly influence the development of the U.S. Redstone and Atlas missiles, which would go on to play significant roles in the Cold War arms race and later in the Apollo space program. In some cases, the U.S. military also sought to keep the rocket facilities under a semblance of operational status. This was particularly true for the Piedmont site, which had been largely destroyed by Allied bombing but still contained vital equipment and infrastructure that could be repaired or repurposed. The Soviets, by contrast, were not content to let these sites remain dormant, and their actions in the wake of the war demonstrated their aggressive desire to acquire any and all military technology that had been developed by the Germans. In the Soviet sector, the immediate post-war period was characterized by a rapid and systematic exploitation of Germany's technological assets. The Soviets took control of the key rocket sites with a level of efficiency that mirrored their general approach to wartime reparations. At Piedmont, which had been severely damaged during the war, Soviet engineers set about dismantling the remains of the facility. Much of the equipment that had not already been destroyed was carefully catalogued, disassembled, and shipped to the Soviet Union. The Soviets also sought to capture the expertise of the German scientists who had worked on the V-2 program. Unlike the Americans, who were more interested in adapting the Nazi technologies for military and space exploration, the Soviets viewed the German rocket program through a more strategic lens. Their primary objective was to gain immediate technological superiority over the West. By bringing in German engineers and scientists, many of whom had worked on the V-2 rockets, the Soviet Union was able to leapfrog its own rocket development efforts. This infusion of German expertise proved crucial to the Soviet Union's own missile and space programs, which would soon become formidable adversaries to the American programs. The Soviet Union's approach to the Nazi rocket facilities was also marked by a deliberate effort to rebuild certain sites for their own use. At the same time that they were dismantling Piedmont, the Soviets were also investing in the creation of their own missile production facilities. The German engineers who were brought back to the Soviet Union were often placed at the heart of these new programs, helping to develop the R-1, the Soviet Union's version of the V-2 rocket. Over the next few years, the Soviets would refine this design and go on to develop more advanced rocket technologies, which would eventually culminate in the successful launch of Sputnik in 1957, the world's first artificial satellite. The repurposing of the German rocket infrastructure by the Soviet Union was not without its challenges. The task of relocating entire factories and adapting them for Soviet production was immense. In many cases, the Soviets were forced to rebuild from the ground up, as the damage to the German sites was extensive. But the sheer scale of the operation, combined with the Soviet Union's totalitarian control over its industrial and military sectors, allowed them to rapidly accelerate the pace of their missile and space programs. Meanwhile, in Britain and France, the fate of the rocket facilities was less dramatic. In the British zone, the focus was more on securing the remnants of Nazi technology to prevent its use by the Soviets or any other potentially hostile powers. The British government had little interest in rebuilding the rocket infrastructure left behind by the Nazis, especially given the large-scale economic recovery efforts underway in the post-war years. The British were already focusing on their own defense and space initiatives, and the idea of investing in German rocketry was not seen as a priority. Nevertheless, Some British officials had a deep interest in the advanced rocket technology and sought to exploit it for their own purposes. British scientists did study the German rockets and adopted some aspects of their design for their own missile programs, but the scale of investment was far smaller compared to the American and Soviet efforts.